I want you to picture a morning. It's April 26th, 1986.
Right.
You're waking up in the city of Pripyat in the Soviet Union. It's a Saturday. You pour your coffee, you look out the window, and you see children already heading outside. They're playing in the courtyards.
Just a totally normal weekend morning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People are getting ready for their weekend shifts. They're going about their perfectly normal, ordinary routines in what was, frankly, considered a model Soviet city at the time.
Oh, yeah. Pripyat was the pride of the system.
Yeah, it really was. But if you look out toward the horizon, just a couple of miles away, there is this strange, eerie, almost beautiful iridescent glow.
Yeah.
Illuminating the sky right above the local nuclear power plant.
It's a chilling image to even think about.
It is, because it's a massive catastrophic event. I mean, the
Yeah.
core of reactor number 4 has literally just exploded. It violently tore open the building, exposing the raw radioactive heart of the machine to the open air.
Right.
And yet, and this is the craziest part, there are no sirens. There is no mass panic. There are no emergency broadcasts telling you to flee. The central paradox of this moment, the thing that should honestly chill you to the bone, is that the apocalypse has literally just occurred in their backyard, and nobody is panicking because there is no visible, immediate threat to run from.
It really is a terrifying image, and I think it perfectly encapsulates the deep systemic dysfunction we are exploring today in this deep dive.
Yeah, definitely, because we're looking at a huge stack of notes and historical analysis today, and our mission is to figure out what really happened.
Exactly. Because what happened at Chernobyl is almost always misunderstood. I mean, the popular narrative, the one we all kind of know, is that it was an anomaly.
Right, like a freak accident.
Yeah, a freak accident caused by a few reckless operators pushing buttons they shouldn't have. Just a fundamentally broken system spinning out of control.
But the reality is so much more disturbing than that.
It is. Chernobyl didn't come from chaos. It didn't emerge from a system that was wildly out of control. It actually came from a system that worked flawlessly.
Wow, really flawed.
Yes. It was an incredibly effective, highly structured machine, right up until its own defining strengths became its fatal liabilities. The disaster wasn't just a physical explosion of steam and graphite. It was the violent, inevitable release of compressed truth.
Compressed truth. Okay, we are going to dig so deeply into the psychology of what that means.
It's the core of the whole thing.
Because this isn't just a history lesson about a broken machine, right? It's a systemic dissection of why things break in the first place.
Exactly.
We want to answer this really terrifying question. Was the disaster at Chernobyl a technical failure, or was it actually an epistemic one? Was it a failure of engineering or a failure of reality itself?
And to understand that, to truly grasp that epistemic failure, we first have to look at the literal mechanical collapse.
The event itself.
Right. We have to look at why the easiest, most common explanation, which is just waving our hands and saying, oh, human error, is dangerously shallow.
Yeah, human error is always the ultimate scapegoat, isn't it?
It is. In any catastrophic failure, it is incredibly comforting to just isolate the blame to a handful of incompetent people working a night shift.
Because if we can blame them, we don't have to look at the terrifying architecture of the system that put them there.
Exactly. But when we actually look at the timeline of that late-night safety test on April 26th, the whole human error narrative just falls apart immediately.
The irony of the situation is just agonizing to me. I mean, they weren't running a rogue experiment.
No.
They weren't pushing the reactor to see how much power they could generate for fun, or out of sheer recklessness. They were running a mandated safety test.
Right, they were trying to make the plant safer.
Yeah. They wanted to see if the reactor could generate enough residual power to keep the essential water cooling systems running during a simulated blackout.
And, the premise of the test was actually very sound. If a power plant loses connection to the main electrical grid, the massive turbines take about a minute to spin down.
Okay, so they didn't just stop instantly.
No, they have a lot of momentum. But the backup diesel generators, they take about a minute to power up and take the load.
Oh, I see. So there's a gap.
Right. There is a terrifying 60-second gap where the massive pumps pushing cooling water through the nuclear core might actually lose power.
And if water stops flowing for 60 seconds?
The reactor can melt down.
Wow. Just 60 seconds.
Yes. So the goal was simple. Use the kinetic energy of the spinning down turbine to power those water pumps just long enough for the diesel generators to kick in.
Okay, so it was a test designed entirely to prevent a meltdown.
Exactly. But the execution of that test becomes this absolute masterclass in catastrophic cascading failures.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's trace the actual physics of this doom loop. So first, the power in the reactor drops way too low.
Right. The output falls to a highly unstable level.
Now, initial reports, and honestly a lot of historical assumptions, put this entirely on operator error. They let the power slip too far down into the danger zone.
And in a standard Western-designed reactor of that era, or frankly in any normal functioning safety culture, that power drop would be the definitive end of the test.
They would just stop.
Absolutely. The protocols are completely clear. If the reactor enters this specific unstable state, which is essentially a state where the nuclear reaction is choking on its own byproducts, you shut it down.
You don't just keep pushing it.
No. You abort the test, you let the reactor stabilize over a couple of days, and you try again later.
But they don't shut it down.
No, they don't.
The operators in that control room try to force the reactor back up. They actively violate strict safety protocols to try and salvage the test.
Yeah.
And to accomplish this, to force this choking reactor to keep running, they deliberately disable the emergency safety system.
They systematically turn off the automated shutdown mechanisms that are literally screaming at them to stop.
Which really begs the question. I mean, I'm trying to put myself in that control room. These are highly trained engineers.
Very highly trained.
So what specific psychological or systemic state makes a rational engineer physically turn off an emergency alarm rather than heed it?
That is the pivotal question right there.
Sure.
To answer it, we have to understand the specific machine they were trying to control.
Right.
Because this wasn't just a generic nuclear reactor. This was an RBMK reactor, a uniquely Soviet design. And it possessed a fatal flaw that was built directly into its physics.
The positive void coefficient?
Exactly, the positive void coefficient.
Okay, let's break down exactly how that works, because positive void coefficient sounds like, really dense textbook jargon, but it is the actual trigger of the apocalypse here.
Let's look at the mechanism. So in a nuclear reactor, you have uranium fuel rods generating massive amounts of heat through fission.
Okay.
You pump water through the core to cool those rods down, and that turns the water into steam, which spins the turbine.
Right, that's how we get electricity.
But water does a second, equally crucial job. It absorbs neutrons. It actually acts as a natural brake on the nuclear chain reaction.
So the coolant is also the control mechanism.
Exactly. Now, if the reactor gets too hot, the water boils and turns into steam bubbles.
Okay.
Physicists call these bubbles voids. And steam does not absorb neutrons nearly as well as liquid water does.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. So what happens in an RBMK reactor when the water boils into steam? You lose your neutron absorber.
You lose the brakes.
Yes. Suddenly you have billions of free, unabsorbed neutrons pinging around the core, striking other uranium atoms, causing more fission.
And more fission creates more heat.
Which boils more water, creating more steam voids.
Which means fewer neutrons are absorbed.
Which causes even more fission.
Wow. It's an uncontrollable exponential runaway train. The hotter it gets, the faster it accelerates.
Exactly. And the critical piece of information here, the really terrifying part, is that at low power, the RBMK reactor became wildly unstable.
The state they were currently in during the test.
Yes. The lower the power went, the more pronounced and violent this positive void coefficient became. It became a complete hair trigger.
So they are sitting there with disabled safety systems, forcing this inherently unstable, highly volatile reactor to stay awake.
Right.
They are pulling the control rods, the physical brakes, almost entirely out of the core just to keep the reaction going.
Yeah, they were walking on a tightrope.
And then they reach the point of no return. They finally realize things are critically out of control. The power starts surging. The runaway train has left the station.
So they hit the AZ5 button.
The ultimate emergency shutdown.
Right. This is supposed to drop all the control rods back into the core at once to completely kill the nuclear fire.
But there's another fatal design flaw, isn't there?
Yes. The control rods have graphite tips. And graphite, in this specific reactor environment, actually speeds up the reaction.
We have to visualize what is happening inside the core in that exact second.
It's vital to understand the physics here. The core is roughly the size of a 3-story building. It is filled with water. When the operators hit the emergency shutdown, these massive control rods drop down from the ceiling. But because the tips are made of graphite, the first thing that enters the lower part of the core isn't the neutron-absorbing boron that actually stops the reaction.
It's the graphite.
Yes, it's graphite.
Yeah.
And the graphite physically displaces the water that was in the channels.
Wait, so you are replacing water, which absorbs neutrons and acts as a brake, with graphite, which actively moderates and speeds up the nuclear reaction.
Exactly. You are creating a massive, localized power surge in the bottom of the reactor. The safety mechanism itself acted as a detonator.
That is horrifying.
The insertion of those graphite-tipped rods caused a catastrophic spike in reactivity. The fuel rods superheated and shattered in a fraction of a second.
Wow.
The water instantly flashed to steam, creating this massive pressure explosion that blew the 1,000-ton biological shield, the massive steel and concrete lid, clean off the top of the reactor.
1,000 tons just blown right off.
Clean off. The core was entirely exposed to the night sky. And unlike Western reactors, the RBMK had no reinforced concrete containment dome to catch the fallout.
So it all just went into the air.
The radioactive material, the burning graphite, the highly toxic fission products is all violently ejected directly into the open environment.
It's just a horrifying irony. It's the equivalent of driving a car toward a cliff, seeing the edge, panicking, and slamming on the brake pedal, only to discover that a fundamental design flaw has wired the brakes to inject nitrous into the engine for 3 full seconds before the pads actually engage.
That's a perfect analogy.
The brakes accelerated the car right over the cliff.
Which is exactly why the concept of human error is just so woefully inadequate here. Did the operators make mistakes? Yes.
Sure.
Did they violate protocol by disabling the safety systems? Yes, they did. But why were those decisions even available to be made?
Right.
Why could a critical safety system be so easily bypassed by a few tired operators in the middle of the night?
Yeah.
Why was a civilian power reactor designed without a containment building?
And most chillingly, why did the ultimate safety mechanism, the emergency shutdown, function as a detonator?
Exactly. The operators in that control room didn't design those control rods. They didn't build a massive nuclear facility without a containment dome.
They were just highly trained engineers trying to do their jobs.
Right, but they were making fatal decisions because their understanding of the machine they were operating was fundamentally distorted.
Because they didn't know the whole truth.
They did not know about the graphite tips. They did not fully understand the extreme volatility of the positive void coefficient at low power, because that specific information had been systematically classified and withheld from them by the state.
So blaming them is really just a lazy way to avoid looking at the architecture of the system that put them in that room.
Precisely. It ignores the environment that put them there with that machine, with that incomplete knowledge under that specific kind of pressure.
If we really want to understand why Chernobyl happened, we have to stop looking at the control room and start looking at the environment that built both the reactor and the operators.
We have to examine the architecture of failure.
Which means we need to establish the baseline of the Soviet system before 1986. Because before something can fail so spectacularly, it must first function.
Right. It didn't just appear overnight.
And the Soviet nuclear program functioned incredibly well on paper. It was an absolute juggernaut. But it was built on foundational pillars that each contained a massive hidden fracture.
Yes. The first of those pillars is the political structure. The Soviet state was defined by extreme centralization. Decision-making flowed entirely top-down, from Moscow to the republics, to the ministries, to the plant directors.
And there are advantages to that, right?
Absolutely. The strength of that is undeniable. Extreme centralization allows for the rapid mobilization of incredible resources.
You can build entire cities.
You can build sprawling industrial cities and complex nuclear grids out of the wilderness in a matter of decades, because you don't have to worry about local zoning laws or public debate.
But the hidden fracture in that political pillar is the sheer rigidity it creates. Because it's entirely top-down, the system relies strictly on control, not adaptability. There is zero tolerance for dissent. You do not argue with Moscow.
Never.
It creates severe information bottlenecks. Because
Yep.
the system punishes bad news, people simply stop delivering it.
And a system that punishes bad news will eventually be destroyed by it. When reality inevitably conflicts with the expectations of the central authority, the response is delayed.
Right.
Nobody wants to be the engineer who tells the Ministry of Media Machine Building that their flagship nuclear reactor design has a catastrophic flaw.
So what happens?
Reality is ignored in favor of the plan. The illusion of perfection is maintained, while the physical fragility of the system quietly grows.
That political rigidity feeds directly into the second fracture, which is the economic model.
Yeah.
The entire Soviet economy was driven by quotas. Electricity was the lifeblood of the industrial empire, and nuclear power was this glowing symbol of their technological dominance. Energy production was the ultimate metric.
And they achieved massive energy generation capacity. But the incentives were entirely misaligned. Success meant hitting production quotas, period.
Just numbers on a page.
Exactly. Efficiency metrics completely ignored risk. And this warps the very definition of a rational decision.
How so?
When an economic model prioritizes raw output over structural integrity, cutting corners isn't an anomaly. It's actually the strategy for survival.
Let me wrap my head around this. So the plant director, Viktor Bryukhanov, and the engineers beneath him, they weren't bypassing safety protocols because they were lazy or stupid.
No, not
They
at
were
all.
doing it because the system actively rewarded them for it.
Yeah.
Like, if they halt the reactor to investigate an anomaly, they miss the power quota. If they miss the quota, the factory down the road misses its steel quota.
It's a massive chain reaction of economic failure.
And the person who stops the reactor is the one who gets blamed, demoted, or, exiled from the party.
Exactly. The system wasn't malfunctioning when it bypassed safety. It was doing exactly what it was incentivized to do.
Wow.
The operators who pushed the reactor too hard during that safety test weren't acting irrationally within the context of their economic reality. They were doing what the system demanded of them. Admitting that the RBMK reactor was unstable meant halting production, which meant failing the quota, which meant admitting a weakness in the ideological narrative of the state.
And that ideological narrative is the third piece of this puzzle, right? The cultural pillar.
Yes.
The cultural identity of the Soviet Union at this time was completely bound up in the mastery of nature.
Right, they conquered rivers, they conquered the atom.
There is this unwavering faith in science, engineering, and the sheer infallibility of the state. They didn't just build nuclear reactors, they viewed them as testaments to human supremacy over nature.
And hubris is the ultimate blind spot. If you believe your system is infallible, you simply stop looking for the flaws.
You stop checking your own work.
You stop testing your assumptions. The engineers were trained to treat these massive complex reactors as perfectly controllable machines. There was a deep cultural reluctance to admit uncertainty if something went wrong. The cultural default was to assume it was just a minor operator error, not a systemic warning sign. The belief that the system could not fail actively prevented them from seeing how close to failure they constantly were.
Which brings us to the social cohesion of the system.
The fourth pillar.
Outwardly, there was high trust in institutions. The workforce was highly coordinated. They shared a national purpose.
On the surface, yes.
Right. But beneath that unified surface, dissent was deeply suppressed. There's a total lack of psychological safety.
People knew things were wrong. Engineers knew the RBMK design was touchy at low power. They whispered about it in the break rooms.
But they didn't speak up officially.
No. There's a phrase in the research that perfectly captures this. Unity without honesty is just silence under pressure.
That is such a powerful quote. Unity without honesty is just silence under pressure.
Because true unity requires the psychological safety to look at your superior and say, I think we are making a colossal mistake. When that safety is completely eradicated by the threat of political retribution, what looks like a unified, agreeable workforce is actually just a group of terrified people internalizing immense pressure instead of resolving it.
And all of these political, economic, cultural, and social fractures converge on the physical infrastructure itself.
The final pillar.
The RBMK reactor design was chosen because it was cheap to build on a massive scale. It could use unenriched uranium, and it could produce plutonium for the military while generating civilian electricity.
It was an industrial workhorse.
But the design flaws were documented.
Oh, they were well known.
They were known by the highest levels of the scientific establishment. They simply weren't fixed because fixing them would require taking reactors offline, missing quotas, and admitting to the West that Soviet engineering wasn't perfect.
They even decided not to build containment domes around these reactors.
Which was a standard safety feature in the West.
Yes. But they skipped it simply to save time and concrete. They literally convinced themselves that Soviet reactors were so inherently safe that a containment dome was just a redundant waste of resources.
So when we look at the ruins of reactor number 4, what actually collapsed? It wasn't just a machine.
No, the machine was just the focal point.
What collapsed was a massive architecture of assumptions. The assumption that authority equates to correctness. The assumption that output matters more than safety. The assumption that silence preserves stability.
Chernobyl didn't destroy the Soviet system. Chernobyl revealed that the system was already fundamentally broken. It was a structural failure masquerading as a functioning enterprise.
This leads us directly to one of the most vital concepts in understanding any systemic collapse, the physics of compressed truth.
Yes. We've established all these various pressures, social, political, economic, and all of these pressures share a common outcome. They suppress reality.
I want to focus intensely on this idea of the broken feedback loop because this doesn't just apply to Soviet nuclear physics.
No, not at all.
I want you listening to think about this in your own life. This applies to modern corporate cultures, political institutions, and even our own interpersonal lives. The dynamic works like this. Reality happens on the ground.
Right.
A machine breaks, a quota is missed, a design flaw is noticed. But before that reality can be addressed, it gets filtered through a bureaucracy, it gets softened, it gets distorted.
It's an issue of signal versus noise. In a healthy system, the signal of failure is amplified so leadership can fix it.
Right, you want to know when things break.
Exactly. But in a rigid bureaucracy, the signal of failure is suppressed because it threatens the hierarchy.
Exactly. So that distorted, softened version of reality eventually reaches the decision makers at the top. The decision makers who are completely insulated from the ground truth make new policies based on an illusion.
And those new policies are fed back down to the workers, making the actual physical situation even worse.
It is a closed loop of self-deception. The people at the top are receiving glowing reports of unparalleled success, while the people at the bottom are struggling with failing equipment and impossible demands.
And because secrecy norms from the military bled heavily into civilian infrastructure, information was incredibly compartmentalized.
And compartmentalization is lethal here, because there were actually previous incidents with RBMK reactors before Chernobyl.
Yes, there were.
Crazily enough, in 1975, at the Leningrad nuclear power plant, an RBMK reactor experienced a localized core meltdown.
The exact same positive void coefficient issue reared its head.
But the incident was immediately classified. The reports were totally buried. The operators at Chernobyl were never told that the machine they were running had almost destroyed a facility a decade earlier.
This is what it means to operate on managed risk without actually understanding the risk.
Right.
The engineers in the Chernobyl control room believed they understood the parameters of the safety test. They believed they understood the capabilities of the reactor. They were confident.
But their knowledge was fundamentally incomplete.
Yes. They were operating a machine that behaved entirely differently than the theoretical models they had been trained on.
That disconnect between perceived reality and actual reality is the true silent killer. You have partial knowledge mixed with extreme overconfidence, and the physics of this situation are just unforgiving.
They really are.
Because compressed truth does not disappear. Information, like energy, cannot simply be destroyed by a bureaucratic memo.
No.
If you compress a gas in a cylinder, you can't just keep pushing the piston down forever. Eventually, the structural integrity of the cylinder fails. Eventually, the truth explodes.
Which brings us to the nature of the collapse itself. We've talked about the architecture and the compression of truth over decades. But the question that haunts historians and systems analysts alike is, well, why did it explode on April 26, 1986 specifically?
Why that night?
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because human nature desperately wants to blame an external force when massive disasters happen.
We always look for an excuse.
We look for an act of God or a saboteur, but we have to ruthlessly rule all of that out here. There was no environmental anomaly. No massive drought affecting the cooling water, no freak earthquake that destabilized the foundation. It wasn't a foreign intelligence operation. The CIA didn't sneak in and plant a bomb.
The disaster was entirely 100% internally generated.
Yeah.
And philosophically, that makes it so much more terrifying. A system that destroys itself from within under perfectly normal external conditions is a system that has fundamentally severed its connection to physical reality.
The explosion itself was not the cause of the collapse. The explosion was merely the release point of all that accumulated pressure.
Exactly.
The reactor didn't randomly fail that night. It was systematically driven into failure by the culture we just described.
To truly understand complex failures, we have to separate the concept of cause from the concept of trigger.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, the collapse of Chernobyl was agonizingly gradual in its cause. It took years of flawed design choices, decades of cultural suppression, a constant misalignment of economic incentives, and the persistent, deliberate distortion of information.
All of those gradual elements built the bomb.
Yes. But the manifestation of the failure was instantaneous. The late-night safety test, the delay of the test by the grid controller in Kiev earlier in the day,
Which pushed it to the exhausted night shift.
right, the overriding of the alarms and the final insertion of the graphite-tipped rods, that was the sudden trigger.
I see. So if you picture a massive, heavy rubber band, the gradual systemic pressures are the hands pulling that band tighter and tighter, inch by inch, over 20 years.
Yeah.
And the safety test was just the final microscopic pull that exceeded the tensile strength of the rubber. It caused the snap.
Exactly.
So is it fair to say that the system didn't just fail to stop the disaster, but actually amplified it?
Oh, absolutely. If we look at the specific failures in the control room that night, the safety protocol, the emergency shutdown button, was the physical catalyst for the explosion.
Right.
The hierarchical governance structure amplified the failure because nobody felt empowered to abort the test when it clearly went off the rails.
The closed information loop amplified it because the operators didn't know the graphite tips existed.
The entire system was perfectly, tragically synchronized to turn a dangerous mistake into an apocalyptic catastrophe.
And if we lazily collapse the cause and the trigger into the same thing, we become completely blind to how complex failures actually happen in our own world.
We missed the whole lesson.
Right, if you just say, oh, the operators running a bad safety test caused Chernobyl, you learn absolutely nothing. Because then your only takeaway is, well, I just won't run bad safety tests. But if you realize the true cause was decades of compressed truth and misaligned incentives, you start to look at every system you interact with completely differently. You realize that the absence of a catastrophic explosion right now does not mean a system is stable.
Which is a profound realization.
Okay, so the core is exposed. The 1,000-ton lid is gone. The reactor has exploded. The system has physically and violently failed. What happens to the human beings inside that system when the physical reality shatters, but the systemic illusion of control is still desperately trying to hold on?
We enter the psychological phenomenon of the cognitive lag.
Cognitive lag.
Yes, the lived experience of a collapse does not match the physical timeline of the collapse. There's a profound split reality.
Yeah, walk me through that.
Down in the plant, the operational reality is an absolute visceral nightmare. The workers who survive the initial blast run into the corridors. They look into the reactor hull, expecting to see massive machinery.
And what do they see?
They see open night sky, rubble, and a glowing radioactive fire. They know instantly the reactor is gone. The core is destroyed.
But the cognitive lag kicks in immediately with the leadership.
It does. Plant Director Brukhanov and Chief Engineer Foman arrive. They are told the core is destroyed, that pieces of radioactive graphite are literally lying in the parking lot.
But their minds cannot process it.
They can't. The system has conditioned them for so long to believe that an RBMK reactor cannot explode that they literally reject the physical evidence in front of their eyes.
That's astonishing.
They report to Moscow that the reactor is intact, that it's just a fire, and that they are pumping water into the core.
But they are pumping water into a void.
Exactly. They are ordering men to go to the roof to manually open valves for a cooling system that no longer exists, sending them to their deaths. This is the ultimate, fatal manifestation of the broken feedback loop.
The leadership's perception of reality is lagging hours and eventually days behind the physical reality.
And the public perception, just a couple of miles away in Pripyat, is lagging even further behind.
The citizens wake up on Saturday morning. They see a fire in the distance at the plant. But the official narrative, the only information allowed to circulate, is that it's just a minor roof fire.
It's under control. Nothing to worry about.
And this leads to that agonizing 36-hour delay in evacuating the city.
Yes.
For a day and a half, 50,000 people went about their lives. They had weddings, they did their grocery shopping.
Children played in the sandboxes, digging in radioactive dust.
It's sickening. People noted a strange metallic taste in the air, the taste of radioactive iodine, but normalcy persisted.
This highlights the cruelest paradox of radiation. It is an entirely invisible threat.
Right.
Human beings rely heavily on their immediate sensory input to assess danger. If we see a lion, we run. If we smell smoke, we evacuate. But you can't see a gamma ray.
You can't smell a mutating cell.
You don't feel the radiation shredding your DNA in real time. And because our sensory alarms aren't triggered, our normalcy bias takes over. We assume everything is fine, even while lethal exposure increases by the minute.
It's incredibly chilling. You know, the system looks incredibly stable right before it fails. It's like Wile E. Coyote running off the cliff in a cartoon.
Yes. That's a great way to think about it.
He has already run past the edge of the rock. He is suspended in midair. The physical support is entirely gone. But he is perfectly fine until he looks down and realizes the reality of his situation.
The stability of Pripyat during those 36 hours was an illusion maintained purely by psychological momentum.
The leadership in Moscow eventually realizes the scope of the disaster, but their first instinct is not protecting the people.
No, it rarely is.
Their first instinct is containment. And not containing the radiation, but containing the information. They cut the phone lines out of Pripyat. They forbid people from leaving so as not to cause a panic.
But reality always forces its way through the bureaucracy eventually.
Well, it has to.
Days later, radiation from the exposed core is detected by monitoring stations in Sweden over 1,000 miles away. The international community demands answers. The illusion of containment shatters on a global stage, and the Soviet system frantically shifts from controlling the narrative to desperate reactive damage mitigation.
The cognitive lag ends. The evacuation finally happens. A line of buses stretches to the horizon to carry 50,000 people away from their homes forever. And we see a massive shift in the psychology of the community.
We really do. Initially, during a disaster, there is massive spontaneous cooperation.
Right.
The firefighters who rushed into the burning plant without specialized gear, the plant workers who stayed behind in the dark, wading through radioactive water to try and prevent secondary explosions. The initial human response was deeply collective. It was driven by a shared ethos of, we will handle this together.
But as the reality of the government's deception sets in, as the realization dawns that the threat is invisible, pervasive, and permanent, that cooperation fractures.
It does.
The physical displacement breaks communities apart, and psychologically the trust in institutions completely evaporates. People begin to question everything they have ever been told.
When you can no longer trust what you see with your own eyes, and you can no longer trust a single word your leaders tell you, societal decision-making collapses.
The official narrative sounds like a desperate lie.
And the tragic paradox is that when official truth is completely discredited, wild rumors become the only trusted source of news. The psychological shift goes from collective civic action to individual survival and total paralyzing distrust.
So the lag between the physical reality and human perception is where the true damage incubates.
Exactly. Systems fail in reality first, and then they fail in perception. And the duration of that gap determines the human toll.
So the dust settles, the fires are eventually put out, though the core continues to smolder for weeks. The system has collapsed. What happens when the dust settles and the system tries to rebuild? What are the brutal trade-offs of reconfiguration?
Well, a collapse doesn't just leave an empty void. It leaves a chaotic reconfiguration. The new system is built under extreme pressure, driven by panic and necessity, not careful design. It prioritizes sheer survival over progress.
Look at what replaced what was lost. First, the energy production system. That was completely lost.
Right.
And it was replaced by a massive containment system. They hastily built the sarcophagus, a gigantic steel and concrete tomb to cover the exposed core. They went from generating immense power to drive a nation to desperately pouring resources into containing an immense poison.
It is a massive, permanent downgrade in function.
An institutional trust was replaced by deep, enduring skepticism.
Yes. The centralized authority of the Soviet state, which previously commanded absolute confidence and fear, was suddenly exposed as incompetent and fragile. Many historians argue that Chernobyl was the massive accelerant, the true fatal blow that led to the eventual dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991.
Because the illusion of complete control was replaced by a stark, undeniable awareness of systemic limits.
On a human level, a stable, vibrant community was replaced by permanent displacement. Pripyat became a ghost town at the center of the exclusion zone.
Which presents one of the most haunting environmental ironies in modern history. The human systems utterly degraded. The land was heavily contaminated with radiation that will last for tens of thousands of years. And yet, in the decades since the disaster, in the absolute absence of human activity, the local wildlife has rebounded massively.
It's incredible. You have wolves, brown bears, wild horses, and lynx thriving in the ruins of the city.
It is entirely counterintuitive.
But we shouldn't romanticize it. It isn't a poetic story of nature healing. It's a stark, instructive demonstration of complex systems. It shows us that when you completely remove human industrial systems, other natural systems will simply fill the vacuum, regardless of the radiation.
Wow.
It demonstrates that normal human infrastructure, the farming, the logging, the constant presence of people, can sometimes be more destructive to a local ecosystem than the worst nuclear meltdown in history.
That is a very heavy thought. But there is another brutal trade-off we have to discuss, An unexpected outcome that is a very difficult pill to swallow. Because of the sheer catastrophe at Chernobyl, global nuclear safety standards improved drastically.
You did.
There was a massive push for greater transparency in reactor design, the implementation of robust safety cultures, and much stronger international monitoring agencies.
It is the ultimate brutal trade-off. Future systems all around the world became significantly safer, but only because this specific system failed so catastrophically. The knowledge gained about reactor physics, crisis management, and the dangers of positive void coefficients was bought and paid for with human lives and ruined landscapes.
Which brings up a point I really want to talk about, the myth of heroism.
Yes.
We naturally gravitate toward praising the liquidators, the hundreds of thousands of men, the biorobots who were sent in to shovel radioactive graphite off the roof, to build the sarcophagus, to wash the streets. And we should praise them. Their bravery is unimaginable. But framing the story of Chernobyl purely as a triumph of the human spirit, as a hero story, has a really dark side, doesn't it?
It has a deeply corrosive side. Heroism, in the context of a systemic failure, is almost always the cost of earlier incompetence. If we solely focus on the bravery of the individuals who cleaned up the mess, we risk masking the systemic rot that caused the mess in the first place. Those firefighters and liquidators were dying to solve a problem that never ever should have existed.
They were paying the ultimate physical price for the compressed truth, the misaligned incentives, and the arrogance of a bureaucracy that refused to acknowledge its own flaws.
Celebrating the heroes is necessary, but if that celebration absolves the system of its guilt, then we have learned absolutely nothing from the disaster.
We've covered the physics, the politics, the economics, and the mass psychology of communities undergoing collapse. To tie all of this together, we are going to look at a truly fascinating psychological framework.
Yes, the Devon archetype.
Right. Researchers analyzing crisis response and systemic collapse developed a modern subpersonality profile, an archetype, to map the kind of mindset required to survive these events. They named this archetype Devon.
The Devon archetype is a brilliant lens to synthesize the historical data into personal application. The researchers define Devon specifically as the late-stage stabilizer.
Let me make sure I understand where this archetype fits into the ecosystem of a disaster. Devon isn't the arrogant bureaucrat covering up the reactor flaws in Moscow.
No.
And he isn't the exhausted operator pushing the wrong buttons in the control room. So who is he?
In the timeline of a collapse, Devon is the person who shows up when things are already spiraling out of control. He represents the mindset of the liquidators or the crisis managers who act without illusion.
Okay.
He is the individual who recognizes that the system is fundamentally broken, steps directly into the chaos to contain it, and refuses to panic.
So he just deals with reality?
Exactly. But critically, he doesn't delude himself either. He understands the massive cost of the situation, and he moves to mitigate the damage using only the brutal truth of the reality in front of him.
The core internal conflict of the Devon archetype perfectly mirrors the failure of the Soviet system itself. His internal tension is the battle between control versus truth.
Exactly. The Soviet system, as we've exhaustively detailed, chose control. They suppressed information, they maintained a facade of order, and they preserved their image at all costs, even if it meant blowing up a reactor.
Right.
Devon, as a late-stage stabilizer, fundamentally rejects that path because he sees where it leads.
So what does this all mean for us?
Hmm.
Because he deeply understands the temptation of control. Because in our own lives, control feels incredibly safe.
It does.
How often do you act like the Soviet bureaucracy in your own life? Control keeps things stable in the short term. If your relationship is failing or your company is tanking, admitting the truth instantly destabilizes your life.
It's messy. It's painful.
So the temptation is to exert control, to suppress the bad news, to smile and say everything is fine, choosing the illusion of containment over the messy truth. But truth corrects the trajectory.
Which brings us to the illusion of containment. The leaders of Chernobyl believed they could contain the risk indefinitely. They believed they could suppress the truth forever through sheer bureaucratic discipline.
But you can't.
Devon wrestles with this same internal trap. He wrestles with the belief that he can carry everything alone, that he can suppress internal chaos indefinitely through sheer willpower and rigid discipline.
But Chernobyl is the violent historical proof that you can't. You do not get to contain everything forever. The laws of physics and human psychology dictate that eventually the pressure will exceed the containment. Something will break.
And so we see the necessary evolution of this archetype. Before the collapse, The Devon personality might believe that true strength equals self-sufficiency, that he must be a lone wolf handling the crisis.
Right.
But the disaster dismantles that logic. Because no one person caused the failure at Chernobyl, and no one person could possibly fix it. The sheer scale of the disaster demands integration.
He evolves into an integrated operator. He realizes that systems fail collectively, and therefore they must be corrected collectively. It's not about becoming softer or losing discipline. It's about becoming completely accurate to reality.
Yes.
You have to rely on the expertise of others, and you have to share the true burden of the crisis.
If we distill the ultimate lesson from this psychological profile and from the disaster itself, it's not a gentle platitude about being careful. It is framed as a harsh, unyielding law of nature. If truth is suppressed, reality will enforce it violently.
Wow. Silence is never stability. It is just pressure building in the dark.
The principle that emerged from that realization should completely change how you interact with the world. You must actively seek disconfirming evidence, not comfort.
Right.
You must never completely trust a system, whether it's a massive government, your corporate employer, or your own ego that cannot tolerate internal criticism. If something feels deeply unstable, you must assume it is worse than it appears, rather than hoping it will magically fix itself.
Let's unpack everything we've journeyed through today. We started with a microscopic physical mechanism, a positive void coefficient, and a graphite tip on a control rod. We zoomed out to see how a rigid, centralized political and economic system incentivized the ignorance of that exact flaw just to meet a quota. We explored the deadly physics of compressed truth, where reality is systematically filtered until decisions are based on total illusions.
We live through the agonizing cognitive lag.
Right, where the machine physically breaks, but human perception takes days to catch up, leading to devastating human costs. And finally, we held up the mirror of the Devon archetype, challenging us to look at how we handle the tension between control and truth in our own internal systems.
It is a massive, sobering architecture of failure. But there's a final, vital takeaway based on the concept of latent strain that we need to leave the listener with.
Okay, let's hear it.
We discussed how the initial phase of a systemic collapse is completely silent. The flaws exist, but the alarms aren't ringing yet.
The system looks perfectly stable right up until the moment it isn't.
Precisely. So look around at your life right now. Look at the institutions you rely on, the technologies you use daily, the corporate culture you work within, or even the most important interpersonal relationships you have. Are they genuinely structurally stable?
Or are they just quiet?
Exactly. Or are they simply in their quiet phase? Do they only appear perfectly functional right now precisely because the small warnings, the minor dysfunctions, and the inconvenient truths are currently being normalized, ignored, and suppressed in the name of keeping the peace?
That is a question that requires real courage to answer honestly. Thank you for joining us on this incredible deep dive. I hope it gives you a new lens to look at the massive systems around you and the deeply personal systems within you. Keep asking the hard questions, keep seeking out that disconfirming evidence, and never forget that a beautiful iridescent glow in the morning sky isn't always a sunrise. Sometimes it's a warning.